My guidance counselor told me I wasn't college material. Years later, she applied for a job at the foundation I now chair.
My high school guidance counselor told me I wasn't college material. Years later, she applied for a job at the university foundation I now chair. I was 17 when Mrs. Holloway, my high school guidance counselor, sat across from me during our mandatory junior year college planning meeting and told me, with the particular confidence of someone who believed she was doing me a kindness, that four-year universities were probably not realistic for someone with my grades and my family situation. She suggested community college, or perhaps a vocational program, something more aligned with where I was likely headed. My family situation, at the time, involved a single mother working 2 jobs and a household income that qualified me for free lunch. Facts Mrs. Holloway apparently considered more predictive of my future than my actual academic record, which, though not flawless, included honors classes and a genuine, if quiet, determination that nobody at that school had bothered to ask about directly. I didn't argue with her that day. 17-year-olds rarely argue confidently with authority figures who speak in the calm, certain tone adults use when they believe they're simply stating obvious facts. I nodded, took the community college brochures she handed me, and went home to a mother who, when I told her what Mrs. Holloway had said, looked at me with a specific kind of quiet fury I'd rarely seen from her before. "She doesn't get to decide that," my mother said, and then, more gently, "but you do." I applied to four-year universities anyway, working through the application process largely on my own, using library computers and late-night research since our home internet was unreliable. I got in, on a combination of need-based aid and academic scholarships that Mrs. Holloway had never once mentioned might be available to students in my exact situation. I left for college the following fall, and largely, over the following 2 decades, put that guidance meeting out of my mind entirely. My career path afterward wasn't dramatic or particularly fast. I studied economics, worked in nonprofit finance for several years, then moved into university development and fundraising, work that genuinely suited my particular combination of financial literacy and comfort with the specific bureaucratic patience higher education institutions require. By my late 30s, after building a reputation for turning around struggling development offices at 2 different regional universities, I was invited to chair the board of a private foundation supporting first-generation and low-income students at a mid-sized state university, a role that involved significant oversight of scholarship funding and staffing decisions for the foundation's small administrative team. I want to be honest that I never once thought about Mrs. Holloway during any of this. She existed, in my memory, as a single unpleasant afternoon from decades earlier, not an ongoing presence worth tracking or resenting. Then, roughly 8 months ago, our foundation posted an opening for a part-time administrative coordinator role, a position handling student outreach and scholarship application support, work that, ironically, involved directly advising first-generation students on college readiness and application strategy. Among the applications that came across my desk during the hiring committee's initial review was a resume from Diane Holloway, recently retired from a decades-long career as a public high school guidance counselor. I sat with that name for a long moment before continuing to review the rest of her application. It wasn't a certainty. Guidance counselors named Diane Holloway presumably existed in multiple school districts, but the timeline matched, the region matched, and something in the specific phrasing of her cover letter about identifying realistic pathways for students felt immediately, distinctly familiar. I made a deliberate decision at that point, one I still stand by. I removed myself entirely from the initial screening process for that specific application, exactly as I would for any personal conflict of interest, and let our standard hiring committee evaluate her candidacy purely on its actual merits, without any input from me influencing the process in either direction. Diane advanced to a final interview based on her extensive experience, conducted by our hiring committee independently. As foundation chair, a brief informal conversation with me was standard practice for all finalist candidates, a formality most people found reassuring rather than intimidating. I recognized her immediately when she walked into that room, and based on the brief flicker of confusion followed by visible recognition on her face, she recognized me too, though clearly without immediately placing exactly how or where. I didn't bring up the guidance meeting directly. It felt unnecessary, and frankly, unlikely to serve any real purpose beyond satisfying an old, mostly dormant resentment I hadn't realized I still carried until that exact moment. Instead, I asked her the same standard questions I asked every finalist, about her philosophy on advising first-generation and low-income students, about how she identified realistic pathways for young people navigating complicated family circumstances. Her answers were thoughtful, generally sound, the product of genuine decades of experience, though I noticed, throughout our conversation, a particular assumption embedded in how she discussed realistic outcomes for students from difficult financial backgrounds, an assumption I recognized immediately, having once been on the receiving end of it myself. Near the end of our conversation, I asked her, directly but without any edge in my voice, how she typically balanced encouraging ambitious outcomes against what she called realistic pathways for students facing significant financial barriers. She answered honestly, describing an approach that, decades later, still centered heavily on family income and circumstance as primary predictors of appropriate educational trajectory. I told her, then, gently but clearly, about a specific meeting I remembered from my own junior year of high school. A conversation about community college brochures and realistic expectations, without initially mentioning that the student in that story had been me. She listened, nodding along in the practiced way career counselors often do, until I finished the story by mentioning, simply, that the student from that meeting was now the person interviewing her for this position. She was quiet for a long moment, processing, I think, the specific and unlikely symmetry of the situation. She didn't offer excuses. To her credit, she said, simply, that she hoped her approach to advising had evolved considerably over the following decades, and that she was genuinely sorry if her comments had discouraged me at a moment when I needed encouragement instead. We ultimately did not hire Diane for that position, not out of any lingering resentment on my part, but because two other candidates, evaluated entirely on their own merits by our hiring committee, presented specifically more current, more effective approaches to first-generation student advising that better matched what our foundation needed. I made sure my personal history played no role whatsoever in that final decision, exactly as it hadn't in the initial screening. I think about that guidance meeting sometimes, not with lingering anger, but with a specific kind of clarity about how easily well-meaning adults in positions of authority can mistake a young person's current circumstances for their eventual ceiling. Mrs. Holloway wasn't cruel, not really. She simply believed, confidently and incorrectly, that she could predict my future based on a single afternoon and a household income figure, without ever asking me a single question about what I actually wanted or believed I was capable of. If you've ever had an authority figure confidently narrow your sense of what was possible for you, based on circumstances rather than character, remember this: the people who decide your ceiling before genuinely getting to know you are rarely the ones who end up witnessing what you eventually build above it. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Silent Empire. New story every week, subscribe so you never miss one. See you in the next one.